morning, everyone.
Oh, okay. I see you.
I want to welcome you all to the next edition of our Java with Joe morning coffee series, sponsored by Tim Hortons this year. So thank you to them for the coffee and donuts. So very happy to have back again our county historian, Dr. Michael Eula, who will be sharing with us a section of his upcoming book, Hidden History of Genesee County.
Yes.
I coach myself on that to remember the so it's something that is very applicable for February being Black History Month. So we're very excited to have him share some more stories of our county.
Thank you. Could everyone hear me? Okay. First of all, I just want to thank everyone for coming this morning. It's really exciting and gratifying when people take an interest in what one is working on, to take the time out of all their schedules to come here. I want to just say that before I start to talk, if you have any comments or questions as we go through this, please interrupt me. I probably shouldn't use the word interrupt. Interject, and we could have a conversation about whatever that point is. This is actually part of a book that initially had been 18 chapters. The first half was published back in April, Historic Chronicles of Genesee County. And this is essentially the second half of that book. I'm not sure yet which publisher I'm going with, but it should be concluded pretty shortly. It's already written. I just have to finish the index. The title is Hidden History of Genesee County. And what I mean by hidden are the developments that are not necessarily perceived at first glance. You have to kind of dig and look beneath the surface. And in this book, I have 6 chapters, and I'll just tell you quickly what they are and where this fits in. The first is I entitle Emory Upton and the Formation of Modern America. The second chapter is the subject of our talk this morning, the idea of freedom, the Civil War in Genesee County. And then thirdly, I shift gears and I talk about what I call Protestants in Genesee County. In the almost 11 years I've been the county historian, it seems to me you can't begin to comprehend the complexity of this county's history unless you spend time looking at the various manifestations of Protestantism. So that's what I do in that chapter. Then I have a 4th chapter I entitled Hidden Illnesses, which is simply a discussion of 5 U.S. presidents going back to the 19th century and their private illnesses and how they were or weren't discussed accurately in the local media at the time. I then again shift gears in chapter 5. Our archives have an incredible collection of cookbooks. So I entitled this American Culture and Cookbooks in Genesee County, 1830 to 1920. Those cookbooks reveal quite a bit about various attitudes in the county at different moments. And then finally, in chapter 6, I look at women's history as I did in my first book, but here I shift the focus in a class sense. And rather than looking at middle-class women, I looked at what I call enslaved and poor women in Genesee County. So let me begin with what will be chapter 2, the idea of freedom, the Civil War in Genesee County. I started out with a quote from a very prominent American historian of the Civil War. Some of you may be familiar with Eric Foner. He said, "Never was freedom's protean and contested nature more evident than during the Civil War." So I begin by saying at the heart of the Civil War lay competing visions of freedom. It was this idea that guided thinking about the Civil War in Genesee County. It was also a concept that generated thinking about other areas of county life, just as it did on the national level throughout the United States. That's one of the themes I address in both books. What are the links between our local history here and the broader national picture? And of course, I'm doing that in this chapter as well. Nevertheless, debates about the meaning of freedom does not obscure the grim realities of the Civil War. This struggle developed into what remains the costliest war in American history. It is sometimes forgotten just how monumental the human cost of this war were. A modern war featuring a deadly combination of new technologies and industrial production, amounting to frightful casualties. By 1865, approximately 623,000 lay dead on both sides, while another 471,000 soldiers and sailors suffered wounds. A prelude to the realities of modern wars in the 20th century, these figures should be placed within the context of a country whose total population, both free and enslaved, amounted to about 31 million people. So just think about the percentages here. In a preface to such World War I battles as Somme and Verdun, the casualty rates for short periods are astounding. In the frontal assault at Petersburg in Virginia, a regiment of 850 soldiers from Maine suffered 632 killed in a half an hour. Rifled artillery, marine mines, Gatling guns, and a host of other new mechanisms of death provided a window through which one could view the future of modern warfare. Ultimately, then, the question is one of ideology. What was the motivating principle behind such carnage? Putting aside the economic incentives driving some to war, for example, northern industrialists in Pittsburgh responding to and profiting from the endless thirst for armaments, which transformed that city into a major industrial center for generations to come. The ideological dimension of the war really revolved around the notion of freedom, both Union and Confederate. As historian Richard Hofstadter once put it, quote, "History is irony," end of quote. Indeed it is, and maybe more so, maybe never more so than within the parameters of the Civil War. In debates on a host of social and cultural topics in both the North and the South, what began as contentious debates in homes, taverns, and elsewhere in emerging modern America, these eventually took on ferocious forms on the battlefield during 4 bloody years. The Civil War was contemporary America's birth pangs, a pain attesting to the emergence of modern ideas about freedom that resonate to this day, both nationally and in Genesee County. County newspapers, such as the Republican Advocate, were replete with stories of county communities sending volunteers for the Union Army and donations for the families they were leaving behind. An article entitled "Byron Awake" captures the widespread enthusiasm for a defense of freedom. Quote, "A meeting of the citizens of the town of Byron was held at Byron Center last evening. The greatest enthusiasm was manifested by men of all parties, but one sentiment prevailed: our country, now and forever, one and inseparable," end of quote. Several enrolled as volunteers after that meeting, and $1,070 was subscribed for the benefit of the families of volunteers. The irony here is the defense of freedom resting alongside families beset with the necessities of economic survival. The assumption that free labor in a capitalist marketplace in 1861 produced prosperity is not sustainable, by evidence of the anxiety of impoverished families in places such as Byron, stranded by soldiers marching off to defend freedom. Entering into the carnage of a modern industrial battlefield in the name of liberty served to accentuate economic anxiety and class inequality in mid-19th century America. Neighbors increasingly offered material support to those less fortunate, or at least to those risking their lives for an ideal. A horrific war stimulated discussion of a cherished American value, the belief in freedom, and how to balance that freedom with community responsibility. This became evident throughout the war. Freedom and its relationship to social responsibility meant different things to various Americans. Nowhere was this ideological complexity more visible than in several areas of debates occurring during the war and afterwards for many generations to come. The first of these debates surrounds the enslavement of other human beings. The discussions of this cruel and inhumane institution revolve to a predictable degree around the concept of freedom. Enslavement, for its proponents and opponents alike, was the linchpin around which debates concerning liberty swirled. For growing numbers of Northerners, what began as a crusade to preserve a union embodying the ideals of freedom morphed through the horrors of modern combat into a struggle to destroy a slave system that by definition stood in stark contrast to an America dedicated to the ideal of freedom. If freedom in the United States included such values as equality of opportunity, competition for economic self-sufficiency, and the sanctity of domestic relations, then how could involuntary servitude ever be reconciled with this vision of America's promise? Surgeon Daniel M. Holt of the 121st New York Infantry expressed this in a letter to his wife on April 20th, 1863. He captures the transformation of the war from a mere effort to maintain the Union and suppress Southern insurrection into a human rights crusade. This change hit upon the key difference between whites who saw freedom as an inherent right that required defense against slave owners who threatened that right, and African Americans traumatized and brutalized by enslavement who viewed freedom as a goal to be strived for. In the process, that quest opened up the possibility of an unending notion of liberty capable of expansion into other areas of life. Holt, someone who had always known freedom, argued that true freedom was only possible when slavery ended, and America had done penance for centuries of brutality. I quote Holt, "It is a righteous punishment, this war, after all, for we as a nation had done evil and not good." End of quote. He then goes on in the starkest of terms, again in this letter to his wife. "How can we, as a nation, expect the smiles of heaven when we hold in bondage, sell and chastise our fellow man, for the simple reason that the color of his skin is not like our own? Though created by the same hand and sustained by the same power, I tell you, Louisa, we shall never succeed until we let the oppressed go free. Never, never, never will God grant us the victory and establish our government until it can be done in righteousness." End of quote. He then concludes, quote, "We cannot roll the sin of slavery under our tongue as a sweet morsel and claim the divine favor. It is impious to call upon God for a blessing while we dare have such cruelty in our hearts. Then let us pull away the evil from among us." End quote. Many in the Confederacy also viewed the issue of slavery from the vantage point of freedom, but in a radically different way. From this perspective, there was no contradiction between liberty and slavery. Drawing upon historical sources reaching back to antiquity, many Southerners understood freedom as the capacity to enslave other people. These Southerners understood slavery as a normal human condition stretching back thousands of years. More recently, Nations known for their love of freedom, Great Britain, France, and Holland, had all helped to orchestrate the trafficking in human beings. Integral to this argument was that the ownership of slaves allowed the owner a considerable degree of economic freedom, which was inseparable from political freedom, as they saw it, in a republic. In other words, we see in the South a world of independent men participating in a democratic order that excluded African Americans who were enslaved. In effect, the free are free, and their liberty remains predicated upon the domination of enslaved people. Witness a law in Virginia in 1780, even before the completion of the American Revolution, rewarding veterans of the War for Independence with 300 acres of land and one enslaved person. This Southern understanding of a freedom restricted to free men ushers us into a second area of debate induced by the Civil War. What was the place of women in a modern America championing freedom? The ideological problem here was clear. How could a war that had developed by 1863 into a moral crusade for universal rights be reconciled with the continued exclusion of women from full democratic participation? If the alleged incapacity for self-government by African American men was being destroyed in the quest to lay waste to slavery, then how could the alleged inferiority of women be taken seriously as a justification for the denial of full political, economic, and social freedom? When, quote, 44 ladies of Genesee and Wyoming, unquote, petitioned the New York State Legislature in March of 1848 to admit into society what they called free citizens, exercising the same rights as men in those counties, they were initiating a call for full democratic participation in this famous declaration from the Seneca Falls Convention in Seneca Falls, New York. The call for inclusion, evident in this petition, intensified among white women in Genesee County by the time of the Civil War. The war, as shown in a village such as Byron, left many women without a male in the household to assist with the economic functioning of the family. The call for expanded rights for women, now compelled to take up work previously shared by husbands, emerged as an urgent, immediate issue. The call for female political freedom increasingly blended with the call for female economic opportunity by 1861. Otherwise, dependency on neighbors for material support would have become the only viable option, one not favored by many women with habits of self-reliance and independence. It is not surprising then that churches in places such as Byron sponsored speakers advocating women's rights in the wake of the Civil War. Their call for the inclusion of rational and accountable beings, as they termed it, reached even greater expression in the midst of a civil war seeking to expand a narrow definition of democracy restricted exclusively to universal white manhood. The Civil War weakened the stifling condition of exclusion that had characterized the American experiment since the Revolution. In the process, the idea of government itself was redefined. This eventually became part of modern America. Maybe the most striking and possibly the longest lasting and most far-reaching consequences of the Civil War was the promotion of a tradition of equality transcending that of the Revolutionary period. The relationship of equality to freedom has had a dramatic impact on American life to this day. It permeates so much of what we think of when we consider what America is. and should be. How Americans understand equality is indistinguishable from the way many of them view the place of the national government. During the Civil War, the national government functioned as the ultimate and most effective guardian of constitutional rights. Apart from the question of wartime suspension of some civil rights during the war, the national government eradicated the very negation of freedom, slavery, and emerged as the only resource capable of ensuring basic democratic rights. Not surprisingly, the Confederacy challenged this depiction of the federal government. For many Confederates, the national government was the greatest threat to individual freedom. For them, it represented the menace of political tyranny. Achieving a balance between local prerogatives and a powerful national state raised yet another debate during and immediately after the Civil War. How does one define civil rights? In addition, what are the most effective ways to ensure those rights? Theories of equality and constitutional amendments fashioned to protect equality raised many issues, from citizenship to voting qualifications to the place of immigrants in a democratic republic. The new national state, born in 1865, meant the birth of an America breaking with tradition. In the process, new definitions of freedom emerged. This takes us back to the competing images of slavery, bursting into violent military confrontation on April 12, 1861. I'll catch my breath for a moment. Does anybody have any comments?
We'll wait till you're done.
Okay.
You're opening up a whole ream of questions here. I mean, the Civil War was an attack to eradicate slavery to some degree. You got to go back to 1940, so I'm thinking of Jackie Robinson breaking into baseball, Jim Crow laws, 1968 when Martin Luther King was killed.
Yes.
I mean, you said in a previous get-together that the population of blacks in Genesee County was about 6%
Yeah, it was even lower.
in
But yes.
1968, which
Yeah.
is incredible. And the struggle went on as far as Jim Crow laws. And then with women, they didn't get to vote until what, 1920 something?
A few
So-
states before that in state elections, but nationally, yeah.
So there's a lot going on.
Yes, and a lot of it, I'm arguing, came out of the turmoil of the Civil War. All right, that takes us to the competing views of slavery. The Civil War brought into sharp relief the dichotomy between freedom and slavery. 25 years before the opening shots of the war, at a March 1836 meeting, opponents of slavery assembled in Batavia to express what one local newspaper called their strong anti-slavery feeling. This was a prelude to the national trauma erupting on the battlefields of 1861, as not everyone in Batavia was pleased with such gatherings. As reported in Western New York media outside of the county, such abolitionist meetings often drew crowds of supporters of slavery, displaying signs of restlessness and potential violence. One of the recipients of this violence was a man named Seth M. Gates of Leroy. Gates was a leader of Genesee County's Anti-Slavery Society. Gates was a lawyer who studied in Leroy and received his law license in 1827. He was described in the Leroy Gazette as possessing an inflexible love of justice and hatred of oppression, with a clear intellect to discover the right and an impending will in the pursuit of duty. He had stern integrity and a high sense of honor, while yet a young man among us. He eventually entered the New York State Assembly, where he emerged as a fervent abolitionist. Moving to the House of Representatives in Washington, His intense opposition to slavery found a national platform. His position on slavery became so well known that it induced a direct threat to his life. He so exasperated the slaveholders, a local historian here wrote in 1903, that no less than 5 governors mentioned Gates in their next messages, and a rich planter in Savannah, Georgia, offered a $500 reward for the delivery of this offending member of Congress, dead or alive. His national fame as a fierce opponent of slavery prompted the famous abolitionist and journalist William Lloyd Garrison to write a long letter of condolence to the family of Gates subsequent to his death in 1877. Violent confrontations in Genesee County and the surrounding area prompted none other than Frederick Douglass to remind Americans in 1862 that the cause of the slaves was a national one. Freedom meant the necessity of slavery's abolition. Yet that same freedom in the South revealed, for Confederates, no contradiction at all between slavery and liberty. The emergent Southern perspective was an elaborate ideological defense of a system of enslavement, which ironically included a definition of freedom, articulated in a variety of ways: political theory, jurisprudence, theology, history, economics, the physical sciences. The basic idea was that slavery is a common feature of human history. The Southern version insisted that it was the most humane because it embodied for those enslaved freedom from economic pressures routinely faced by the free population. It simultaneously liberated some among the free population from the need of pursuing the necessities of life. In other words, the free population, or at least the elite of owners enslaving others, were able to pursue the affairs of state integral to the maintenance of a democratic society. In an 1858 speech, James M. Hammond, a slave owner and U.S. Senator from South Carolina, expressed this view in the strongest of terms, quote, "In all social systems, there must be a class to do the menial duties, to perform the drudgery of life. Such a class you must have, or you would not have that other class which leads progress, civilization, and refinement. Fortunately for the South, she found a race adapted to that purpose," end of quote. The idea that freedom develops through slavery never took root, obviously, in the African American community. Political theory was no match for lived reality. The niceties of rhetoric could hardly withstand the savagery of the lash. Not only did enslaved people witness and personally experience the horrors of forced servitude, but just as importantly, they observed the meaning of freedom for those fortunate enough not to be enslaved. By 1861, enslaved people had long dreamed of escaping, and in some cases actually had escaped, from the terrors of family separation, physical punishments, sexual assault, and the pervasive whip. They saw in the Civil War not only an abolition of slavery, but also an opportunity to enjoy a government-led enlargement of the rights and benefits of American freedom. The process of expanding American democracy to include African Americans continued during Reconstruction because of the presence of federal authority in the defeated South. Freed slaves threw themselves into July 4th celebrations because it was in such expressions that the national government, as the guardian of democratic rights, were acknowledged as the guarantor of those rights. The very tenets of American society, so long denied to the enslaved, the sanctity of family life, property ownership, freedom of movement, and suffrage became part of daily life because of federal intervention. Unfortunately, the end of Reconstruction in 1877 ushered in an era of segregation and lynching, once again relegating African Americans to a marginal existence largely outside of American life. It would take a second Reconstruction, the modern civil rights movement, to compel once again the nation at large to think about the idea of freedom in ways it had not since the Civil War. The tactics and the rhetoric of that seminal moment in modern U.S. history, its continuous and courageous demand for freedom, had their precedent on the battlefields of the Civil War and in confrontations between supporters and opponents of slavery in places such as Batavia so long before. Just as abolitionists had made strides as a result of the sacrifices taking place between 1861 and 1865, so too did those who perceived the need for a focus on the lack of freedom faced by American women in Genesee County and elsewhere through the middle of the 19th century. Not surprisingly, the intense focus on freedom emphasized by abolitionists throughout the Civil War fostered a growing interest in the applicability of freedom to women in the county. As already suggested, this manifested itself earlier when 44 ladies of Genesee and Wyoming, married women of the town of Darien in the county of Genesee, petitioned the New York State Legislature in 1848 to recognize, quote, "Your Declaration of Independence declares that governments derive their just powers from the consent of the governed, and as women have never consented to, been represented in, or recognized by this government, it is evident that injustice, no allegiance can be claimed from them. Your laws, after depriving us of property, of the means of acquiring it, and even of individuality, require the same obedience from us as from free citizens," end of quote. These women from Darien expressed, on a local level, what growing numbers of women were declaring nationally in the years leading up to the Civil War, that women could, indeed should, walk down the same path to freedom that slaves were already on. It was fitting that the 44 ladies were married. In the years before the Civil War, female activists agitated for a freedom liberating wives from what they called the slavery of marriage. In the 1848 petition by Genesee and Wyoming County women, they expressed this both irreverently and ironically, quote, "We therefore think common justice and humanity would dictate that when you class us and our privileges with those of idiots and lunatics, you should do the same with regard to our responsibilities. And as our husbands assume responsibilities for our debts and trespasses, they should also for the misdemeanors and crimes. For justice can never hold lunatics, idiots, infants, or married women, as the law is, accountable for their conduct," end of quote. Union victory and the consequent destruction of slavery accelerated the feminist movement. Writers such as Abigail Scott Duniway, whose royalties supported 6 children and a husband whose business had failed, argued for a freedom for married women that included payment for housework and equal ownership of family property. Like others, she asserted that with the cessation of enslaved people viewed as property, and since Southern slaveholders no longer extracted unpaid labor, then homemakers too should have the same rights. What justification was there for unpaid labor performed in the home, she asked. It was a short leap from the demand for economic freedom to a call for liberty in other areas of life. Economic equality meant political equality, and political equality meant the right to vote. In the years following the Civil War, this manifested itself locally in such groups as the Political Equality Club in Genesee County. In April of 1899, a meeting of this group took place in Batavia, and it included such speakers as Harriet May Mills of Syracuse, who was the New York State organizer of the Women's Suffrage Association. Such meetings were common, as evidenced by a lengthy description in the summer of 1888 in the Batavia Daily regarding an overflow crowd at Byron Center's Presbyterian Church. People there heard the speeches of two of the country's most prominent feminists, Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony. This was not the only lecture given by Anthony in the county, for she returned as late as 1905 to speak alongside her sister, Mary Anthony. The analogy of African American slavery and the political and economic inequality faced by both married and unmarried women through the Civil War set the stage for the feminist movement of the post-World War II period. Despite the ratification of the 19th Amendment in 1920, giving women full and equal voting rights, feminists argued that the question of equality in other areas, including economic, still needed attention. The Equal Pay Act of 1963, the Civil Rights Act of 1964, and the depiction of the, quote, problem that has no name, unquote, by Betty Friedan are just some examples of issues initially addressed by those 44 ladies so long ago, and which, at least in part, still existed in contemporary American life. Concerns such as economic and political equality, be it for slaves or for women, or both in the case of African American women, needed attention within a legal and governmental framework. The question of government, its appropriate size and responsibilities, was one raised in the ferocity of the Civil War battlefield. I'll stop for a moment. Does anybody have any comments or questions? All right, that brings us to the
You're so comprehensive, where do we start, okay?
I'm sorry?
You're so comprehensive, where would we start?
It's also so contemporary, isn't it? This brings us to the role of government. As described in the Gazetteer and biographical record of Genesee County, 1788 to 1890, the Confederate attack on Fort Sumter aroused the same patriotic feelings in Genesee County that were manifested throughout the North. And for the time, all partisan feelings were forgotten. Men of all parties evinced a desire to sustain the government. Nonetheless, to sustain the government, it was necessary to expand the reach of the federal government. During the Civil War, the role and size of the United States government underwent dramatic change and growth. The radical shift in federal fiscal realities embodied the clear growth of a national government featuring an increasing array of regulations and agencies, forming the foundation for an activist federal government that became part of daily life by the early 20th century. During the war, the federal government facilitated such domestic projects as the Transcontinental Railway and planned a new road to run between Omaha and Utah and then further west to California. The federal government assisted small farmers through the 160-acre allotment of the Homestead Act of 1862. It also extended help to college students through the financing of colleges whose focus was engineering, agriculture, and military science education with the Morrill Land Grant Act of 1862. In such ways, the federal government expanded its reach into American life. From this perspective, the activist state enhanced freedom. However, for the Confederacy, a federal government giving African Americans and others a glimpse of a better life was one that posed the danger of tyranny. This perception transcended the obvious role played by the Union Army and Reconstruction policies in the South through 1877. The underlying rationale for this perspective remained an understanding of freedom, anchored in a reading of the Constitution in which ultimate political power emanates from the states and not the federal government. By 1861, this view formed an integral part of a Southern tradition that was essentially agrarian and hence removed from the far-reaching changes produced by industrialization throughout the North. The economic modernization in a new society, that which was more centralized and dependent upon regulations and non-traditional ways of doing things, was simply foreign to the South. This is what George Fitzhugh had in mind when he authored 2 books on the eve of the Civil War. A self-taught Southern lawyer, he wrote Sociology for the South, or The Failure of a Free Society, which came out in 1854, and his second book, Cannibals All, or Slaves Without Masters, which emerged in 1857. An advocate of slavery orchestrated at the local level, Fitzhugh asserted that all human societies exhibited a lower class who suffered. He argued that slavery eased the plight of the poor because it solved the problems of unemployment and the exploitation of the working class. His view culminated in the idea that because slaves were capital, they received food, shelter, and clothing. In addition, they could not be fired and then face starvation. Poor whites, as well as African Americans, he argued, should be enslaved as a means of enhancing their personal freedom by liberating them from poverty. A federal government questioning this understanding of freedom posed the threat of tyranny. It was only through local political control that slavery, and consequently for Fitzhugh and other Southerners, that freedom is possible. However, in the North, freedom equaled a powerful national government alone capable of extending and preserving liberty for the most vulnerable Americans. It was the Northern perspective in opposition to a Southern version of freedom, initially resting upon slavery, which persisted long after 1865. By the post-World War II period and the emergence of the modern civil rights movement, the necessity of federal intervention designed to promote freedom became once again apparent. Nevertheless, the Southern perspective, with its dramatically different understanding of a freedom anchored in states' rights, continued to form the basis for a conflict still evident today. That brings us to what I call American nationalism. The idea of an American people originates during the American Revolution and the creation of a new nation. Despite the diversity of the 18th century population and membership in the British Empire, the upheaval of 1776 produced a new society whose members desired freedom as citizens in a new republic. Nevertheless, that community did not include slaves or Native Americans. Accordingly, the Revolution unleashed a debate over who was an American and who was not fully American. The Civil War, with its objective of preserving the Union, only intensified a debate stretching back 80 or so years. The Civil War eventually assumed the dimension of a moral crusade serving to eradicate slavery and bring the ex-slave into full participation in American life. Full participation meant an enlargement of the definition of American freedom. In other words, to be an American meant to commit oneself fully to an ideal of freedom, including a belief in equality and democracy. In the person of a Seneca Native American from Genesee County's Tonawanda Reservation, one sees the embodiment of an American nationalism resting upon the basis of a more inclusive definition of freedom, and hence of what it means to be an American. That person was Hassananda, I'm mispronouncing that, in other words, leading name better known to us as Ellie Parker. Parker was a Native American from the Tonawanda Reservation who was born in Pembroke near Indian Falls in 1828. At that time, Indian Falls was home to the Seneca Nation. The Seneca Nation remains a part of Genesee County today, as we all know, on the reservation and beyond. The story of Parker is especially interesting when placed alongside an 1831 case heard by the U.S. Supreme Court. In Cherokee Nation versus Georgia, a case arising out of the seizure of much of the Cherokee land by the state of Georgia, the court concluded that Native Americans were, quote, wards, end of quote, of the federal government. In other words, Native Americans enjoyed some safeguards, but they lacked the standing of a citizen afforded treaty or natural rights. To be fully free in America depended upon as much group membership as it did upon universal human rights. Native Americans enjoying tribal sovereignty were not members of an American society resting on the foundation of individual liberty. However, the Civil War, its eventual stress upon the eradication of slavery and the consequent enlargement of full inclusion, could not help but to have an effect on Native Americans. Excuse me. While it would not be until 1924 that all Native Americans would be granted United States citizenship, the movement to include more Americans in the community of American democracy advanced dramatically on battlefields of the Civil War. One Union general in particular represented this shift, and this was the aforementioned Parker. Parker began life on the Tonawanda Reservation. He had learned as a child to track deer and follow the trail of a snake. He eventually learned to combine such experiences and learning with those of the wider society. He studied law, but failed to gain admission to the New York State Bar because Native Americans lacked standing as citizens. He also studied civil engineering, and at different junctures in his life, worked as an engineer for both the state of New York and the U.S. government. His training as an engineer led to his military service during the Civil War. This native of Pembroke could not initially volunteer for military service because he was a Native American. However, his training and experience as an engineer eventually enabled him to overcome this prejudice, and he received a commission as a captain in the Army, serving as an engineering officer with the 7th Division, 17th Corps. When Ulysses S. Grant became commander of the Union forces, he requested that Parker join his staff. Grant knew of Parker because of an initial meeting in Galena, Illinois in June of 1860. Through mutual work there on federal projects, the two became friends. This led to Parker's appointment as an assistant adjutant general on Grant's staff on September 18, 1863. The following summer, Parker became Grant's military secretary. By the end of the war, he served with Grant and wrote out the surrender document under Grant's direction at Appomattox. After the war, Parker served as Commissioner of Indian Affairs in President Grant's administration. Parker's participation in American life at high governmental levels symbolized the Civil War's unleashing of a drive to enlarge the possibilities of entitlements to the full expression of American freedom. Given the language of freedom becoming increasingly common in the North as the fighting deepened, it is not surprising that Parker, sensitive to the realities faced by untold Native Americans, should be afforded the protection of the federal government in a manner similar to the protections extended to African Americans during Reconstruction. Freedom and full integration into American society could not take place absent such safeguards. By the end of the Civil War, Parker maintained that, and I quote, "The Indian races are more seriously threatened with a speedy extermination than ever before in the history of the country. It seems to me that no pains be spared to avert such an appalling calamity befalling a portion of the human race," end of quote. Parker's life and outlook portended the future trajectory of an American nationalism clearly taking shape during the Civil War. By the post-World War II period, historical forces that had first gathered steam in the years leading up to the Civil War created a social upheaval in which America's most excluded members, such as Native Americans, continued to demand a place at the American dinner table long denied them. The American Indian movement, the events at the Pine Ridge Reservation in South Dakota in 1973, and Native American challenges to such holidays as Columbus Day all reveal a quest for inclusion enunciated by someone such as Parker. His was the call for a freedom only possible through the intervention of an activist government whose purpose included that of advancing civil rights. Direct confrontation is the only way to fight evils embedded in America, as in the case of the South during and after the Civil War. Reconstruction, Parker observed, was, quote, "an act of humanity to retain troops in the late slaveholding states in order to protect the Negro in his life, person, and the few rights he has acquired by becoming a freedman, to guard against an unjust oppression of the Negro, to prevent personal conflicts between the two races, and to see that equal and just laws are enacted and executed seems to be the combined duty of the Freedmen's Bureau and the military in the South," end of quote. Parker's call for a strong federal presence in the South was an effort to make abstract notions of American freedom concrete. He was part of a Civil War stimulus having the long-term effect of changing an American freedom enjoyed by few into one featuring equal opportunity and protections accessible to more and different kinds of people. It was the Civil War's call for civil rights. The 28th Regiment, it's another section, civil rights, New York State volunteers, included men from Genesee County. Many of the volunteers enlisted within 3 days of the Confederate attack at Fort Sumter. Company officers such as Captain C.H. Fenn, First Lieutenant W.W. Rowley, and Second Lieutenant G.M. Elliott were all organized with their men in Batavia. The regiment included soldiers who were among some of the first in New York to enlist. In an article published after the war, in which the author, described as a comrade, writes of the peace we fought for, there is an advocacy of a national government alone retaining the power to ensure individual freedom through the maintenance of a union bound by a framework of constitutional legitimacy upheld by laws and the courts. These transcended mere states' rights. Can a government of the people, it said, by the people and for the people, stand strong and centralized against internal sedition and sectional differences. These questions this war answered. It said in thunder tones, yes, this confederation of states is a nation and not an aggregation, end of quote. This anonymous comrade in the 28th then added, quote, that for which we fought was the doctrine of an indissoluble union, and that for which we fought we achieved. What was achieved apart from the maintenance of the union, what was maintained and extended, was a governmental framework capable of securing a fuller participation in American democracy, not only eliminating slavery, but also expanding the rights enjoyed by all, including African Americans, by placing them beyond the reach of local majorities and their institutions. Accordingly, this anonymous veteran posed this question: who would have dared in 1865 to prophesy the facts of 1896? He then said this: in 1865, there were not 50 college-bred Negro preachers in America. Today, there are more than 1,000. In 1865, there were 2 Negro attorneys. Now there are 250. In 1865, there were 3 Negro physicians. In 1895, there were regularly practicing 749. There are 250 Black American students in the universities of Europe. In 1865, you might as well have searched for hot ice as for an African school teacher. Now there are 20,000 and 150 schools for advanced education, of which 7 are colleges presided over by African presidents and faculties, and 3 of these college presidents were themselves slaves, end of quote. He then added, in 1861, when the war began, for a Southern Negro to know how to read was a crime. Now 2,250,000 have learned to read and write. Then they had not a single school. Now they have 25,530 schools operating through some part of the year. 30 years ago, the entire taxable property of the Negro was $12,000. Now it is $264 million. Who would have dared to prophesy part of all of this? End of quote. Here one sees an emphasis upon the expansion of participation in American life reaching a frenzied pitch on the Civil War battlefield and becoming a reality through legislative action. The 13th Amendment prohibited slavery, but that was only the first of many legal steps on the path to ensuring freedom through the operation of civil rights enforcement. The national state, echoing President Lincoln's Gettysburg Address, endeavored to set forth and protect the rights of all Americans. Therefore, the Civil Rights Act of 1866 proclaimed that all people born in the United States were citizens, with the notable exception then of Native Americans. Central here was a basic civil right, the right of equality before the law. This premise of equality extended to economic rights, such as the right to initiate a lawsuit, to enter into a contract, and to be secure in one's property. In an effort to make these rights realities, the 13th Amendment received congressional approval a year after the Civil War ended. The objective of this amendment was clear: to prohibit the states from denying citizens their legal privileges and to secure the equal protection of the law. While designed to elevate former slaves to the level of equal citizens, the 14th Amendment had a positive impact on the lives of immigrants who arrived in the country through the early 20th century. 2 years later, in 1868, The 14th Amendment was given formal approval subsequent to ratification by 28 of the 37 states. This precluded the states from making race a prerequisite for voting. These amendments, along with the Civil Rights Act of 1866, embody two clear outcomes of the Civil War: a newly formed and powerful federal government, and the ideal of a national community of citizens equal before the law. This legislative activism at the national level was the result of the Civil War. It left a legacy that was subsequently interrupted, but which eventually resurfaced during the administration of President Franklin Roosevelt, and then under the leadership of Supreme Court Justice Earl Warren between 1953 and 1969, a time in which an enormous enlargement of the rights enjoyed by growing numbers of Americans occurred. Indeed, as that anonymous comrade, wrote, it was a peace worth fighting for, a peace which without the war could never have been. This takes me to my conclusion. As we have seen, Emory Upton of Batavia displayed zeal as a reformer. In the book itself, as I said, I talk about Emory Upton in chapter 1, so the reader has already seen that. While a young cadet at West Point, he was never reluctant to criticize what he viewed as the major problem of mid-19th century American life. Among these were intemperance, political corruption, secularism, and not least of all, slavery. Despite the presence of cadets from the South, he did not hesitate to identify himself as an abolitionist. His willingness to confront supporters of slavery at West Point led to his being avoided by some or compelled to fight by others. When a cadet from South Carolina named Wade Hampton Gibbs, made derogatory remarks about Upton's relationships with African Americans while an Oberlin College student, Upton challenged him to a sword fight. Upton emerged from the altercation with a minor facial cut and his views intact. As he entered active service as a second lieutenant in the 5th United States Artillery on May 7, 1861, he wrote lengthy letters to his siblings in which he expressed his deepest political convictions, adamantly defending the necessity of federal power and the preservation of the Union. He identified slavery as America's greatest evil. He laid the blame for it on Southerners, who he said were engaging in treason when they advocated states' rights. He concluded one letter with a sentence articulating his astonishment and disgust with the Confederate position. He could not imagine the continued existence of slavery in modern America. Upton's sacrifices on the battlefield, like those of so many others, laid the groundwork for an expansion of freedom during the Reconstruction period and then long after. Despite Reconstruction's limitations, African Americans enjoyed an unprecedented exercise of freedom and political power. When the Ku Klux Klan's terror in the South and Northern weariness produced a retreat from the gains made through 1877, the effect was profound disappointment in countless African American communities, and yet a hope founded upon such things as constitutional amendments. These amendments eventually received new life in the years following World War II. The idea of freedom and inclusion that people such as Upton and Parker and many others from Genesee County agitated and fought for before, during, and after the Civil War helped to pave the way for a call for change that characterized American life from the 1950s on. The quest for constitutional equality, culminating in the work of the modern civil rights movement, was really a demand to fulfill the promises of the Emancipation Proclamation and the 14th Amendment. It was a call for the United States to fulfill its moral and legal promises, to summon the country to live up to values originally expressed in the Declaration of Independence. In such a call, what better tribute could there be to the sacrifices of generations of Genesee County residents who in some cases risked their lives or gave them in the pursuit of freedom and equality for all of us residing in the United States. That ends that chapter. Thank you.
Yeah. You talk in generalities about abolition feeling in the North, but it was not consistent, like with the experience of the farmer who owned hundreds of thousands of acres, Garrett Smith, the abolitionist society in Utica, got drummed out by the people, had to go cross country, start up his own village in Peterborough. And also, talk about slave wars. When I was down around Atlanta, I went to a mock average plantation, and it was set to, not like Gone with the Wind, you know, with the big columns, those are only on the coast, but modest means with about 20 slaves, and the whites worked with the slaves. So these general images are broken down somewhat.
Well, a couple of responses. I absolutely agree. Historians of slavery have long concluded. If you look at, say, the tax list for slaves as chattel property, had to be listed on the tax list in the South as late as, say, 1860, I'm thinking one study. The average farm, the number of slaves was about a half a dozen, 4 to 6. I absolutely agree. But I would say that even with that in mind, for those 4 to 6, as opposed to the gang labor of who knows how many on the huge plantations, the same issues about freedom and slavery still existed for the individual. I mean, again, they're not going to concern themselves with, you know, tax list or census studies. All they know is that their wife was sold, their children were sold, they've been sold away from their family, they had to watch their wife scream and get whipped and all the rest of it. So for them, I don't think there's any difference, frankly. I didn't go into any of that because it was really not germane to the argument I was making in the chapter. With regard to the abolitionist here, there's no disagreement. There were different kinds of abolitionists. The county was rife with conflict. I just touched upon the amount of conflict that was here in the decades before the Civil War over the issue of slavery. It was very, at times, violent. And people were very impassioned about this one way or the other. So, again, no disagreement there. I only had enough space to include a couple of examples. And I have to say there's a practical issue as well. These publishers are very strict about word counts. So my book, this book's 48,000, I think, 663 words. You go one word over that, it's sliced. So you have to, that's just part of historical writing. You have to pick and choose what you think, in this case, are the best examples. But I don't disagree with what you're saying. I mean, yes, the evidence is there.
I'm not saying that you are presenting a simplistic picture, but it was not simplistic. It was many more nuances. And later, during the Civil War, led to riots in New York City and Detroit because the laborers thought that with the freedom of the blacks, they'd come and take their jobs.
Right. And there was also a class issue, like in the New York City riots in 1863. You've got primarily poor Irish immigrants who said, oh, wait a second, I don't have the $300 to to pay for a substitute. But, well, why is it that some rich guy down the street is enabled to stay up here, be safe, and I have to go down there and risk my life for people that have nothing to do with my personal life? I mean, I'm hard pressed as it is, living in the slums of New York City. Again, no disagreement there. That's just a problem inherent in writing any history, that you're going to, I mean, it is something that bothers me, but I don't see a way out of it. You're going to have to generalize. So I tried to anchor this in, again, the biggest anchor was what's going on nationally is taking place here locally. What's taking place here locally has complexities. I only can talk about a number of them because, among other things, they won't allow more words. That's why this originally couldn't be the 18-chapter book, because it was just way too many words for the history press, which opposed that first one. So yeah, again, no disagreement. And in all the years I was teaching history, I have to say, it often bothered me on the way back to my office, talking about pick your subject. I'm generalizing, and I know I'm generalizing. I'm trying to be as objective as possible, meaning that I will let them know what my perspective is initially, and then they can do with this as they want. But there's no way I'm covering everything. Nobody can talk about it.
Maybe someone else has another question.
It's impossible. But that's an excellent point, I agree. I'm so sorry.
Yeah, question. In New York State, when was it that slavery was outlawed, and was the law enforced?
It was a gradual emancipation that started at the very end of the 18th century. I think it was 1797, somewhere there. And then if you look at the census records, like we have those in the history department for the county, the numbers of slaves goes down every year. And then eventually here, again, I'd have to look at the exact year, but it would say no later than 1850, it's gone. Right, and of course there were again, the complexities. There were those who were arguing, well, wait a second, we don't now have forced bondage. But look at what poor people are facing. There's economic slavery, there's economic bondage, all those debates continue, they still continue. But yeah, the actual institution itself, and of course it never had the same numbers here that it had in the South, in part because in the South you had a very different economic system. You had the production of cash crops, which by definition meant more need for more laborers. Here you had small farms to a greater degree, and there wasn't the same need for slave labor economically. And there was also a strong enough abolitionist movement. You have to remember, in the South, yes, were there abolitionists? Absolutely, but that was a felony. If you were caught with abolitionist literature, you could be hanged. Wow. So it was very dangerous to be an abolitionist in the South. And again, I don't judge people too harshly like this. You think about, our own lives. How many of us are willing to take a stand on a really controversial issue and risk going to prison? And risk maybe being executed? Or watching your family members undergo those things. I mean, that's a huge issue. But yes, so abolitionism up here, if I can use the word, it was, for abolitionists at least, it was almost chic. That's a nice thing to be. Down south, you're a felon.
Slavery was formally abolished in 1827.
In New York State?
Yes.
Oh, I thought it was even earlier, wasn't it?
Well, I mean, completely.
Completely, yes.
No, as you said, it was gradual, and there's different categories that kept lopping off.
But it wasn't until the 1850s that the census records indicate that it broke the slaves.
Correct.
So we're someone coming around saying, hey, you got to get rid of your slaves. This is
right, and then of course you could bring all this to contemporary issues. I mean, in our own day, the issue I know when I lived in California, there was this big issue about reparations. African Americans should have reparations because they had so much labor extracted from them. Well, it raises really practical questions. One, how do you know your ancestor was a slave? Two, how do you know that the people you're compelling to pay the reparations that their ancestors owned slaves, maybe they didn't even live in the country.
And
So
also,
how do you go about determining
Yeah,
that?
I mean, unfortunately, history is, this is going to sound callous, and I don't mean it that way, but it's full of examples of injustice that we simply don't have the power to redress. I think it's important to know that things happen, because it helps us. I mean, as one historian once said, I study the past to understand the present. But I don't think you could use the past to try to redress grievances, say in a lawsuit.
Yeah, right, exactly. It's too far back.
It's too
you
far
know?
back, yeah.
It's too far
I
Because
mean,
you-
even how these people have legal standing, that they're personally aggrieved in a standard civil case, huh? I mean, and why somebody owe them? How about all the rest of us? Well, so my relatives,
Oh, yeah.
hypothetically, came from Ireland.
Well, I was
You
just
know,
gonna
I mean, where is that?
Exactly, I mean, go on out with this.
And
The Russian
And
American,
the tremendous overburdening amount to California's outrageous budget.
yes, well, that
deficit.
part of the problem is that, that's another topic. I learned over the years as I got older to just basically keep my mouth shut in many conversations, because I wouldn't have any friends left, or family. But the reality is that a lot of people basically practice history without really studying it. You know, if I went out there and practiced medicine without an MD degree, I'd get in a whole lot of trouble. But, I mean, people constantly use historical evidence to substantiate a position, and this includes people, obviously, in public life, and yet they haven't really studied the problem. And yet they use it as a justification to make decisions about our own life today.
Decisions they want to make. 'Cause they
Yeah,
can't.
and then they pick out of the past what they do look at. Well, here's my evidence. Well, wait a second, it's more complex than that. I mean, you said Irish, I was immediately thinking, what about generations of Russian serfs? They were bought, sold, whipped, raped legally by their owners in Russia. Nikita Khrushchev, he has the Khrushchev name because that was his grandfather was a Khrushchev because that was the owner that owned his family. I mean, where would you stop with this?
Yes.
That we owe reparations to Russian Americans. I mean,
You don't
you
own
can't
anything.
address all
I
that.
go by Martin Luther King, you know, a person, let's say, judged or assessed upon the content of their character as an individual.
Well, that was the essence of the Civil War, ideologically, yes. John?
Just going back, based on what you presented here today, and just the conversation with regard to Irish, it seems like the Constitution was written for and included specifically white Anglo-Saxon men who were property owners. Didn't include women, didn't include Native Americans, didn't include blacks to some extent, 4/5. And then gradually over time, Civil War, 14th Amendment, 20th Amendment, waves of Irish, Italian, Catholics.
Right.
Over time, the Constitution has been covering more and more people. So you're right, you know, I mean,
Right.
when you talk about reparations, you can say, geez, you know, Italians didn't have a break. They couldn't join Godfrey's Pond. They couldn't hold office in Genesee County.
There are endless examples.
Catholics, I mean, you could go right on down the line. So,
Yeah, but look who wrote the Constitution.
white, Anglo-Saxon
And,
men.
and they tried to backtrack on it. They, after a certain time, they said, okay, the states had to ratify it. They said, whoa, we're giving away the store here. We got all these farmers, okay, and they're owing all this money to the banks, and the banks are forgiving them. We've gone too far. And then they tried to pull it back.
And then, of course, you could also, oh, yeah, you mentioned that. Oh, I had another qualifier. It was only property white men who could vote until, I think it was
I left
1827.
sorry.
I mean, so poor white men, and poor meaning if you couldn't own property, most likely you had limited resources because it was an agrarian society. Owning real estate was the basic capital for most people. They couldn't participate any more than anyone else who was denied the vote could. I mean, that comes, the point that I tried to make here is that the Civil War expands the promises of the Revolution to increasing numbers of people.
Mhm.
And to see it simply as, well, it's to African Americans only, no. That's why I include a section on women. That's why I include a section on Native Americans. So, yeah, and it's still in some ways expanding. One could argue there's a debate in our own day. Some argue it's expanded too much, it's expanded in the wrong ways. you know, we're still having these debates that essentially started in the mid-19th century about what does it mean to be in America? What does it mean to be an American?
Did I hear you correctly? Native Americans didn't become American citizens until
1924.
1924.
Yes. Yeah, when Jim Thorpe won all his medals in the 1912 Olympics, he was not an American citizen. Yeah, I mean, that's a whole other issue. I had relatives who lived in South Dakota near Pine Ridge, for example, and that goes back to when you had the issues there in 1973, and then beyond, even right, all really, as far as I know, through our own day, that what they call the natives in the public schools are treated dramatically different than the non-natives. There is still a pecking order. And even with all of this, it hasn't stopped, apparently. And, you know, it's not formalized. You don't say, oh, natives sit in the back of the classroom. But there are all kinds of indications that they're seen as different. And in many ways, not even welcome off, say, the Pine Ridge Reservation. You know, when Robert Kennedy Sr. was running for president in '68, he went to the reservations in places like South Dakota. He was astonished at the poverty. I mean, and actually, it's true. I mean, I've driven through the Pine Ridge. It looks like the third world. It's abominable that it exists like this. And of course, we see, you know, there's also still a lot of incipient name calling. Well, it's like this because so many were drug addicts and so many were alcoholics. The other way to look at it is that they don't really have any economic opportunities off the reservation, so they're stuck, and they're dependent upon these federal handouts, essentially. That's not necessarily something they all want, but they don't necessarily have a choice. So it's, in effect, you're blaming the victim. This is a long-standing problem. And it started to be addressed, as I'm saying, during the Civil War in a big way. Someone like Ellie Parker really, I think, embodies that. When he's Native American, he becomes a Union general. So, John?
I mean, we're all old enough here to remember George Wallace standing in front of the school in Alabama when they were trying to integrate. And he said, these children are not going to come to school unless it's over my dead body. And that's all something we probably remember vividly, at least I do. And I know there's loads of examples that we still go to.
And it wasn't just the South. I mean, when Martin Luther King goes to Chicago in 1967, I think it was, or 68, one of those two, he said when he was being pelted with rocks and all that, they were trying to, he was campaigning there to integrate housing, to allow people to even apply for an apartment who weren't white. There was just venom directed, and he said he thought he had seen hatred in the South. He never saw hatred until he got to Chicago. So it wasn't, in all fairness to the South, it wasn't just a Southern issue. That's another issue.
So it's not such a distant past from us, is it?
I'm sorry?
It's not a distant past from us.
Oh, no, I absolutely, I mean, again, I think we're still in many ways discussing some of these same issues.
So I got a question. After the Civil War, there seems to be an expansion of inclusion. More people get included. After World War II, same thing. What happens if you have a war, and you happen to be one of these unfortunate societies that loses the war? What happens to inclusion there? I think we have to have like non-American examples.
You mean, you're asking me about other countries?
Yeah. I'm just asking you to think about.
Well, it could be fatal. For example, it wasn't about race. If you look at Vietnam after 1975, the new government in Hanoi made no pretense. They simply sent people out politely, knocking on your door, rounding up people in what used to be called Saigon, who were seen as supporters of the South Vietnam regime, and they simply took them out and shot them. So if you're seen as one of the people who lost, it could literally, since you're asking about foreign countries, it could be fatal. Look at the Russian Revolution.
Right.
I mean, if you weren't a Bolshevik, you got a big problem in the 1930s.
Yeah, and those are both countries that had civil wars, but I mean, look, imagine a moderately unified country that has a war and then loses it. You know, maybe you could look at France after World War I, something like that.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, you look at, I was thinking US or foreign countries, but I was thinking, again, the Vietnam period, let's be honest, we didn't win the war, we lost. I hate to say it as a veteran, but we lost. And the reality is that veterans came back and were treated terribly. That's not myth, that's fact. You had to hide your uniform, you didn't say you were even in the service, you just kept it quiet. That was like that for, that's where all this stuff today about, you know, thank you for your service. There's kind of a collective guilt out here that veterans were treated so poorly, resulting from their participation in the war, that many of them too opposed, but what do? You're getting drafted, or you're volunteering because you don't have a job in your community, or you're going to go to Canada, you know, all the rest of it. So the losers were the victims, came back and treated abominably. So even in our society, yeah, I mean, you lose a war, you got a problem, for any of a number of reasons.
I think we're going to cut it off there. There's a lot of good discussion, but thank you again, Michael, for your presentation. Thank you, everybody. Reach out to Michael if you have any other questions at the County History Department. We've got a lot more to say on everything. So just a couple of things coming up. Our next guest speaker is this Saturday at 11 a.m. Dr. Michael Boston from SUNY Brockport will be talking about female conductors on the Underground Railroad, specifically in Central and Western New York. Then we've got another guest speaker, March 6th, Dr. Ann Bunch, also from SUNY Brockport, will be talking about her new book on the William Morgan affair and some her take on the evidential reasoning on what may have happened to him. The next Job with Joe will actually be our curator, Tyler. He'll be talking about our new exhibit, A Dressmaker's Work, Fashioning the 19th Century, which he's a TV star now. He was just on Channel 2 News in Buffalo yesterday morning, so about that. And we have another guest speaker in March, Chris Mikowski, who's a well-known Civil War historian. We'll be talking about the last days of Stonewall Jackson. And celebrating St. Patrick's Day, we have No Blarney back on Friday, March 14th from 7 to 9. So a lot going on this month. It's on our Facebook, it's on our website. If you're a member, and if you're not a member, become a member and you'll get our weekly emails about everything going on. So